My name is Margaret, a 33-year-old housewife. After graduating from college, I capitalized on the accounting qualification I earned during my studies and joined a mid-sized trading company. I worked in the accounting department, but quit when I got married to my husband, Andrew. I met Andrew at a wedding of a colleague from the company. We ended up sitting next to each other at a table arranged for friends of the bride and groom. Initially, it was group outings with everyone from that table, but during our second outing, a barbecue, Andrew and I exchanged contact details. From then on, Andrew would regularly invite me out for meals, movies, and shopping, and gradually we started seeing each other alone. I was naturally drawn to Andrew, who was bright and a great conversationalist. It seems the feeling was mutual, as Andrew eventually asked me out formally, leading to a relationship. After about 1.5 years of dating, we got married. I had intended to continue working after marriage, but as we were to live in the condominium Andrew had bought while he was single, commuting to my workplace would take quite a long time. Considering a transfer within the company wasn't a quick solution, I was contemplating my options when Paul, my father-in-law, made an offer.
If it's okay with you, Margaret, would you like to help with the accounting at my company?
At your company, Paul?
Yes, one of our longtime staff members is leaving to accompany her husband on a job transfer, so we're looking for someone to replace her.
Paul exclaimed, showing me the job posting he had put up on a recruitment website.
The terms are as listed here, but if they don't align with what you're looking for, feel free to decline,
Paul said considerately. However, the salary and benefits were actually more favorable than I expected. The company's headquarters, where I would be working, was only about a 15-minute commute from our condominium, and it would mean less scheduling conflicts with Andrew, who also worked at Paul's company. I saw it as a stroke of good fortune and decided to join Paul's company. Paul's construction company handles a wide range of projects, from private homes to stores, commercial facilities, and mid-sized condominiums. Paul had worked for one of the largest domestic general contractors, but decided to start his own business after becoming dissatisfied with the decreased autonomy following a capital tie-up with a foreign company. He started this company with colleagues who shared his vision. Despite many challenges, it has grown into a reputable, solidly managed company. Initially, the daily accounting tasks and the company culture at Paul's firm were quite different from what I was used to at the trading company, and it took some time to adapt. But I was helped by the predecessor who stayed on until the last minute before her move, and by supportive colleagues. I made a point of arriving early and completing tasks I wasn't familiar with before the workday began. I didn't want to be seen as incompetent or a burden to Paul and Andrew just because I was hired through connections. Andrew was very supportive of my efforts. When he came home early, he would cook Italian dinners he had learned to make when he was single, or he would do the cleaning, making sure I wasn't burdened with all the household chores. My former colleagues and friends who visited would often say, "You're so lucky." I couldn't help but feel grateful for such a happy married life. But then, one day, this happiness abruptly shattered, leaving no trace behind. That day, while I was attending a meeting at work, a woman from the General Affairs Department burst into the meeting room in a panic and shouted at me, "The president has been in an accident at a business location. A car is waiting at the service entrance. Hurry to the hospital." I can't quite remember the details of what happened next. It all passed in such a blur. Next thing I knew, I was sitting on a long bench in the hospital corridor, outside the operating room, stroking Andrew's back as he sat next to me. Andrew was trembling slightly, repeating over and over,
"Why, Dad? How could something like this happen?"
As for my mother-in-law Nancy, sitting opposite us, she seemed too shocked to think, unresponsive to anyone who spoke to her.
"What good will it do if I panic now? I need to stay strong."
While I was internally frantic, I gritted my teeth upon seeing Nancy in Andrew's condition. Paul, having undergone what felt like an endless emergency surgery, was put under strict rest and taken to the intensive care unit. We decided to go home for the time being, but Andrew couldn't leave Nancy alone, so he decided to go to his parents' house with her.
"Would you mind taking care of the communications with the company, Margaret? Mom has never been involved with the company, and I really don't think she can handle it right now."
Andrew asked me this with a face heavy with fatigue. "Of course, that's fine. You take care of Nancy. Make her your top priority." I replied before seeing them off and hailing a taxi to rush back to the company. After saying that, I watched them leave. Then I hailed a taxi and rushed to the company. At the company, various people, including clients who had heard about Paul's accident the day before, bank representatives, and both current and retired employees, had gathered, all concerned about Paul's condition. The ones who took control of the chaotic scene and informed everyone of Paul's condition were Paul's ally, Thomas, the current vice president of the company, and his wife, Sarah. Under their clear instructions, the employees' agitation settled down, and the company returned to normal operations. Relieved to see this, I must have let go of the tension that had been building for over 24 hours because I fainted right there. When I came to, I was lying on a sofa in the reception room, with Sarah looking over me worriedly. "Are you awake? Don't strain yourself to get up. Do you need me to call a doctor?" "I'm sorry for the trouble. I think it's just lack of sleep," I replied. Sarah, seeming relieved, sat back down on the sofa and handed me a sandwich and coffee. At the sight of the food, I suddenly realized my hunger, and my stomach growled loudly, making me blush. Sarah, however, maintained her stern expression. I thought for a moment she was angry about the inconvenience I had caused, but it turned out I was mistaken. "Anyway, what are Nancy and Andrew doing?" Sarah started to express her displeasure about Nancy and Andrew. According to her, while it's understandable that they are in shock, it's unreasonable for them to be staying at home at such a time. "Dumping the company matters on you? Who's still a newlywed? Andrew should be rushing to the company at a time like this." As I flustered at Sarah's barely concealed irritation, Thomas came in to calm her down. It turns out Sarah, not only the wife of Paul's ally Thomas, but also a college classmate of Paul's, was well aware of Paul's private life. "It was actually Paul who introduced me to Thomas, you know." "So you know Nancy well, too." "Oh yes, I know her very well. I shouldn't say this in front of you, but she's quite a piece of work. You should be careful around her." Sarah said this with a sly smile, which was honestly a bit scary. Thomas urged me to go home and rest properly, so I left the company without hearing more details. 2 weeks after the shocking accident, Paul's condition finally stabilized, and though visitations were limited, he was able to move from the intensive care unit to a regular ward. When Andrew and I received the news, we headed to his room. There, Paul lay with numerous tubes attached, a painful sight to behold. My tentative greeting was met with a weak smile and a slow response from Paul.
"I'm sorry for worrying you so much, Margaret. I'm still a bit groggy from the painkillers. Quite embarrassing, really."
I quickly assured Paul that it was all right, but Andrew, sitting heavily on a chair beside him, blurted out,
"Really? What a hassle. Dad, you get to just lie there? But we're the ones dealing with all the trouble you've caused."
He even let out an exaggerated sigh. I couldn't believe he would speak that way to his injured father, but Andrew, thinking I agreed with him, said,
"Well, we've seen his face now. Done our duty, so let's head back, Margaret."
However, I couldn't stop worrying about Paul. In these past 2 weeks, I had vividly witnessed the scheming nature of Nancy that Sarah had hinted at. At the in-laws' house, under the pretext of Nancy's frail health, they had employed a daytime housekeeper, but now she saw an opportunity to use me for free. All household chores and miscellaneous tasks at the in-laws' house fell on me. Moreover, Andrew, suggesting we might as well live at the in-laws' house, moved most of our belongings from the condominium without my consent. This forced cohabitation with the in-laws shattered my image of Nancy as a reserved and kind lady with class. While she sat on the sofa doing nothing, she would nag about dust here, fingerprints there, and criticize me for everything, even saying, "Such a loud and vulgar way to walk. To think you're the wife of my son. It's laughable." At first, I wondered if it was my fault, trying different approaches, but Nancy's snide attitude remained unchanged. So I tried discussing this with Andrew.
"Can't be helped. After all, there's a big difference between Mom's ideal daughter-in-law and you."
And that's what he said. I was taken aback by his sudden revelation.
Yeah, she always wanted a young woman. Fresh out of college, she said women who've worked in society have too strong opinions and are impudent, tainted by the smell of society.
Smell of society?
Also, someone who can play piano, ballet, and appreciates art. She said a daughter-in-law, not from the city, would pass on unsophisticated rural DNA to future grandchildren.
So, a country-raised woman like me, without cultural skills like piano, and who choose dual income, is completely out of the question for Nancy.
Yeah, that's about it. But good for you. Being raised in the country, you might have the physical strength for both housework and a job, right? This is a perfect chance to win Mom's approval.
A perfect chance, huh? Understanding the reason behind Nancy's attitude didn't ease the strain. Complaints about the taste of my cooking being too country, or dissatisfaction with how I did the laundry. Constant criticism from morning to night was both physically and mentally draining. But when I brought this up to Andrew,
that's something you can solve by respecting Mom more. I'm already busy with the company because of Dad's absence. Don't bother me with trivial matters.
His response offered neither resolution nor comfort. During my struggles at the in-laws' house, Paul's injuries healed to some extent. The next issue was his rehabilitation and caregiving during the recovery period. Initially, the prognosis for Paul was pessimistic, but ultimately, while he might not walk independently as before, it seemed 80% of his arm functions could be recovered through rehabilitation. Paul wished to transfer to a rehab hospital for specialized training, but Nancy firmly opposed it. He's coming home first. Rehabilitation can be done commuting from home or through home visits. If he stays in the hospital any longer, people will talk that we can't even take care of our own husband. It'll damage my reputation. She was adamant and wouldn't listen. When I consulted with Paul about this dilemma, I thought of asking Andrew to persuade Nancy. However, Andrew, who had been blindly obedient to Nancy since we moved in, only said,
Mom's right. If Dad stays in the hospital, think of the rumors.
There was no changing his mind. Ultimately, it was decided that Paul would recuperate at the in-laws' house after being discharged. Thomas, hearing this, hurriedly arranged for modifications, like a ramp and a bath lift, but Nancy and Andrew opposed them, calling it all unnecessary expenditure. An irritated Thomas retorted,
Even if it was a self-caused accident, there's insurance money. I'm not asking you to pay for everything, so please keep quiet.
Thanks to his firm stand, the house was mentally remodeled to accommodate Paul's needs. But the life of managing housework, work, and caring for Paul alone was overwhelmingly challenging. I woke up at 4 a.m. to prepare laundry, breakfast, and lunch for Paul and Nancy, ensuring Paul's meal was high in protein and low in calories for easy digestion. Cleaning couldn't be done until Nancy and Andrew woke up to avoid complaints about noise, leaving me no time for my own breakfast. Rushing to work, I couldn't take a proper lunch break or stay for overtime. After work, I had to stop by the supermarket, then rush to the pharmacy for Paul's prescriptions from the visiting doctor twice a week. Back home, chores continued nonstop. Laundry, dinner preparation, setting up for Paul's shower, helping him bathe, ironing, with no moment to rest. Perhaps because of this, in the months since Paul was discharged, I lost 10 pounds and developed dark circles under my eyes. Feeling the weight of my body like lead, I asked Andrew to hire a caregiver helper, but he and Nancy laughed it off, saying,
Then just quit your job. You can focus on housework and caregiving easy, right?
I felt darkness envelop me when Andrew said that. And true to his word, Andrew submitted my resignation to HR without my consent. Thomas came to our house, concerned about me being forced to quit without any transition, but Nancy turned him away. However, with Paul unable to manage on his own, I couldn't afford to be despondent. This marked the beginning of a life of nonstop caregiving and housework from early morning till late at night. Though Paul tried not to bother me too much, only minimally remodeled, was full of hazards for him, still unaccustomed to his wheelchair. And if I spent time on Paul, Nancy and Andrew would complain about neglected housework. One day, apparently having heard their yelling, Paul asked me worriedly,
It seems Nancy and Andrew are saying terrible things to you. Are you okay? You look emaciated and pale.
Unable to tell the truth, I laughed it off, saying, "It's just my way of doing things that irritates Nancy and Andrew." But Paul, being perceptive, must have seen through it. Around this time, Paul had started using voice recognition software and assistive mouse devices to operate a computer, even planning to return to work. As part of this, he was implementing a certain plan, which was expedited by an incident that happened soon after. It was winter. The city corners twinkled with Christmas lights, a world apart from my daily grind of chores and caregiving. Then, on the 30th, as the year was drawing to a close, Andrew came home from work, and together with Nancy, announced something shocking.
We're going to Australia tomorrow.
Australia? What do you mean?
I can't stand the cold in winter. So, I thought, why not relax and refresh with Andrew? Watching the sea in Australia.
Are you leaving Paul behind? And I asked for this long holiday off well in advance, remember? As I confronted Andrew, he avoided my gaze, looking guilty. Earlier in the winter, my grandfather had passed away, but the memorial ceremony was postponed to avoid clashing with Christmas and New Year celebrations. Unable to attend the funeral due to Paul's condition, I had hoped to at least attend the memorial. But with Andrew unlikely to cover for me, we agreed that during the long holiday, he would care for Paul while I visited my grandfather's grave. This change to Australia? I was speechless, just staring at Andrew. Unable to bear the silence, Andrew suddenly yelled hysterically,
Shut up! It's decided. We're going to Australia, and you'll stay here to take care of Dad.
With that, they both retreated into Nancy's room. The next morning, while I was still helping Paul with breakfast, they left in a taxi. Hearing the door slam, I knew they had gone. My face, having not slept a wink from anger the night before, must have been terrible. Paul, tapping on my shoulder, said,
Now's our chance. While the cat's away, don't worry about me. Go get some sleep in your room.
Normally, I would have refused, but at my limit, I nodded quietly, went to my room, and collapsed into bed. What I thought would be a short nap turned into a whole day and night. I woke up past noon on New Year's Day. Wait, what about Paul's care after that? I panicked and rushed to Paul's room, only to find it full of people, all surrounding a half-seated Paul in bed. Confused, I was greeted by Paul.
You look much better after a good sleep.
As I turned to a tap on my shoulder, I saw Thomas smiling just like Paul, and a puzzled Sarah. My goodness, Margaret, how much weight have you lost since I last saw you? Being slim is one thing, but this is almost skin and bones. Sarah grumbled, pushing me towards the kitchen. To my surprise, several unfamiliar women were there, smiling and swiftly preparing a light meal. Staring at the steaming dishes, I murmured, When was the last time someone cooked for me? Sarah seemed to tear up beside me. Urged by her, I took a shower, changed in my room, and then returned to Paul's room, now only occupied by Paul and Thomas. Paul gestured me to a chair opposite him, and Thomas, noticing my presence, began to speak. About 3 weeks after Nancy and Andrew flew off to Australia, it was mid-January. While spending some time at my parents' house after a long while, I received a call on their landline from Andrew. He probably called me there because I must have turned off my mobile phone. I thought about ignoring it, but knowing he would keep calling regardless of the time, I reluctantly answered. As soon as I picked up the receiver, Andrew yelled from the other end.
Hey, why did you go back to your parents' house without telling me? And where's Dad? The front door won't open, and there's no response to the doorbell.
Shocked by his loud voice, I was stunned, but then Nancy, who seemed to have snatched the phone from him, screamed. You left the caregiving and housework, thinking you were fulfilling your duties as a wife. Stop wasting time there and come back immediately. Then Sarah, who had been quietly listening beside me, swiftly took the receiver from my hand. Oh, Nancy, to hear you talk about a wife's duties, how thick-faced can you be? She said laughingly. Andrew and Nancy sounded shocked on the other end, but they quickly composed themselves.
Is that Sarah's voice? Why are you at your parents' house?
Oh, she's here to explain to my parents about our divorce, being a lawyer and all. There was a moment of silence on the other end. That's right. After Andrew and Nancy left for Australia on New Year's Eve, Paul, who had been quietly planning something, decided to move his plan forward. He had been angry with Nancy and his son Andrew for their attitudes towards him and me since the accident. Initially, he thought their coldness was understandable considering his self-inflicted accident. But their carelessness, leaving all caregiving and housework to me, gradually turned his frustration and disgust into action. Once it was feasible to manage at home, Paul asked Thomas to set up a computer and internet during Nancy's absence. Since Nancy never entered Paul's room, it was apparently easy to install everything once they brought it in. The main goal was to return to working from home, but at the same time, Paul consulted Sarah, Thomas's wife, and a skilled lawyer about investigating Nancy and Andrew. Soon they received reports of Andrew, using his title as the president's son, forcefully pushing difficult demands and bribes on clients. To add to the dismay, he was reportedly using that money for affairs with various women. Moreover, Nancy had become engrossed in dubious investment seminars, resembling nightclubs with young men, and was lavishly spending on them. Paul, understandably furious upon receiving these reports, was unsure whether my feelings had drifted away from Andrew. However, his anger exploded after their recent trip to Australia. As soon as I fell asleep, he contacted Thomas and Sarah. The crowd I saw upon waking up were movers arranged by Thomas and temporary housekeepers. From there, Nancy and Andrew's belongings were successfully moved out of the house to Andrew's apartment. In contrast, my belongings that were left in the condominium were all transferred to the in-laws' house, and the locks were completely changed. At the same time, Thomas and some trusted associates were tirelessly working on gathering evidence for Andrew's breach of trust. Now, this Australian trip? 3 weeks. That's extravagant. And all paid with the company's corporate card, huh? Maybe he could have fooled the sales department people with promises of future favors when he becomes president, but not this time. Sarah said. There was a scream on the other end, and the call was cut off. In fact, I was at my parents' house, relaxing thanks to Paul's arrangement, when Sarah came to apologize on Paul's behalf and explain the situation. That's when Nancy and Andrew, locked out of the in-laws' house, happened to call. Afterwards, with Sarah's help, I easily divorced Andrew, and Paul divorced Nancy. For Nancy, with no money to pay compensation, the settlement was without any financial division. Andrew had no significant assets, but Paul gave me an amount he deemed fair for compensation and division, and made it a loan to Andrew. The loan agreement was properly drawn up with market average interest rates set, and the condominium where Nancy and Andrew now live was mortgaged as collateral. They seemed desperate. Andrew, naturally fired from Paul's company, is now working hard at a factory owned by one of Thomas's acquaintances to repay the debt and avoid bothering me. Meanwhile, I moved out of the in-laws' house and started living in an apartment nearby, working at Paul's company. The in-laws' house has been completely renovated to suit Paul, who now runs the company actively from his room, transformed into a control center. Life has been improved with a good housekeeper and a personal contract helper for Paul, who seems more vibrant. Though no longer related by marriage, I still help Paul as much as I can.